story1, story2, story3, story4, story5, story6, story7, story8, story9, story10, story11, story12, story13, story14, story15, story16, story17, story18, story19, story20, story21, story22, story23, story24, story25, story26, story27, story28, story29, story30, story31, story32. Story 33, Story 34, Story 35, Story 36, Story 37, Story 38, Story 39, Story 40, Story 41, Story 42, Story 43, Story 44, Story 45, Story 46, Story 47, Story 48, Story 49, Story 50, Story 51, Story 52, Story 53, Story 54, Story 55, Story 56, Story 57, Story 58, Story 59. Story 60, Story 61, Story 62, Story 63, Story 64, Story 65, Story 66, Story 67, Story 68, Story 69, Story 70, Story 71, Story 72, Story 73, Story 74, Story 75, Story 76, Story 77, Story 78, Story 79, Story 80, Story 81, Story 82, Story 83, Story 84, Story 85. Story 86, Story 87, Story 88, Story 89, Story 90, Story 91, Story 92, Story 93, Story 94, Story 95, Story 96, Story 97, Story 98, Story 99, Story 100, Story 1. 1 Story 1, 2 Story 1, 3 Story 1, 4 Story 1, 5 Story 1, 6 Story 1, 7 Story 1, 8 Story 1, 9 Story 1, 10 Story 1, 11 Story 1, 12.